that we making sure that we understand, that people are hearing us and understanding us, and that we look like the people that we're serving and reaching out to. So next slide, please. We want you to become our friend. So we would love it if you haven't already, and I recognize faces here and know that you're already a friend of Environment for the Americas. You can join us as a friend at a variety of levels, which has a variety of benefits. And so we encourage you, perhaps even after this presentation, go online, join and become our friend so you can get our newsletter and other information and be part of the conservation solution for birds and getting our message out. Next slide, please. And so we want you to stay in touch, visit our website, email us, ask us questions, give us ideas, and then look at our social media. So follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook, share with your friends and your family all of the great things that we share throughout the year. And then I'll take the next slide, Daisy. So tonight we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Steve Pruett-Jones. And I'm real excited to look at his book. But our next book club is a pocket guide to pigeon watching. And that will be on Thursday, March the 17th, depending on what time zone you're in. It could be 4 p.m., 5 p.m., etc. So please register for that, purchase the book. It's a delightful book. And we will look forward to having that conversation in March with the author of A Pocket Guide to Pigeon Watching. But for now, we'll close out of that slideshow and come back to our author for this evening. And so thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And if you haven't already, put into the chat where you're joining us from, just so we know, how all the different places that you are. And let me introduce Steve Pruett-Jones, our guest for this evening. He is an associate professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Chicago. He's joining us from the Chicago area-ish, around there. He has spent, over, I think, 40 some years studying biology and behavior of birds in North America and Papua New Guinea, as well as Austria, I believe, if that's correct, Steve. Is that right?
Australia.
Australia. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I was going back to when I was a child and we went to Austria. All right. So,
Steve, you're already a co-host, so you can share your screen if you want.
Yeah, I turn it over to you, Steve. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. Good evening, everybody. Just forgive me a second here. Let me get the slideshow started. Again, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite things in life, parrots around the world, and in this case, introduced and naturalized parrots. As Alicia said, I am a field biologist. I have a research program in Australia that has occupied me every year, in the autumn in the United States, in the spring in Australia since 1976. Sometimes it's hard for me to think about that length of time, but that's when I first went to Australia and when I saw my first parrots. Crimson and Eastern Rosellas in a suburb of Victoria, Australia, and I've been interested in them ever since. But it's really been since I came to Chicago in 1988 that my interest, I developed a secondary interest, if you will, about parrots, because Chicago is home to the most common introduced and naturalized parrot that we have, the monk parakeet, shown here on the upper right-hand side. In other places of the world, the rose-ringed parakeet shown in the cover of the book is more common, but here in the United States, we have the monk parakeet. So I just have a 10, maybe 12, I promise no more than 15-minute presentation, just to sort of lay out some of the ideas, just a couple of graphs, mostly just to tell you about why I think this topic is interesting, and a little bit about the book. And I'm happy to hang around as long as people have questions. If you have any questions after this presentation, it's very easy to find me or to find my email address if you just enter my name into a web search. My web page at the University of Chicago comes up, and I'm happy to chat with you about any of these topics that we're going to talk about. So this is an edited volume. It's not just about the United States. It's about all of the naturalized parrots around the world. 35 authors from 10 different countries, and I specifically tried to include as many people around the world working on introduced parrots as possible to get everyone's perspective. 19 chapters broken up into 2 parts, what I call background and ecology. Those aspects of ecology or human reactions to parrots, or positive and negative aspects to these species that apply to all of the parrots, whether we're talking about Australian parrots or Argentinian parrots or United States or species in Europe. And then the second part are case studies, either about the 2 most common species, the rose-ringed parakeet or the monk parakeet, or case studies about individual countries, Europe, South Africa, South America, Australia, United States, etc. So I wanted to provide both general perspective, or I sought out authors, I sought out research specialists that could talk about case studies, the situation in their country, as well as general ideas that would apply to all of the species. So one of the most important aspects of the book and understanding parrots is that we have had an incredibly long history of interacting with parrots. There's very good documentation that humans have kept parrots as pets and have transported parrots around the world for almost 2,500 years, and probably much longer than that. Depending upon the taxonomy, depending upon which authority or book or listing of species you consult, you can either conclude that there's 387 species of parrots or 380, but approximately 380 to 390 species of parrots are listed alive today or extant. The amazing thing is that almost 3/4 of all of these species have been moved around the globe by humans in the pet trade or the wildlife trade. So approximately 330 species or subspecies have been traded internationally. And we're talking many millions of birds, sometimes millions of birds every year, but certainly tens of millions of birds, even if you just look at it within the last 30 or so years. So about 380 species, about 330 of these are moved internationally. About 130 of these are occasionally seen in the wild, and now approximately 75 to 80 species are breeding in at least one country in approximately 90 countries around the globe. So massive numbers of individuals of very large, very many species now have established themselves in many countries. This map just shows you the world and which countries are the biggest exporters. Not surprisingly, the United States and European countries are the largest exporters, but most of those exports involve captively reared species that are already present in that country or are kept as pets or kept in as breeding stock. But wild parrots are still being exported at very large numbers. So it's no longer the case that only captively reared birds are being moved or being sold or being traded for the pet market. It is still the case that many species of wild parrots are exported. I'm happy to talk about semantic issues and what you call different species later on, but it should occur to all of you that the different people, government agencies, biologists, the general public uses many different terms to refer to introduced and non-native species in a given area. What we're talking about tonight are species introduced into an area from their native range, introduced into an area where they were previously not breeding, but now they have established a population and they are in effect a resident breeding bird species. And that's what we are referring to as naturalized species. You can call them introduced, you can call them alien, you can call them foreign. That depends upon how you view this, the semantic issues in this field of invasion biology or the biology of introduced species. We're interested in those species that have been released or have been escaped or have escaped in a new area, established themselves, and now they have a self-sustaining population. That's what that's what I am calling a naturalized species. Some of those become invasive, most of them do not, but we can also talk about that later. But we're also talking about, I just want to briefly mention, we're also talking about native species that move around, that move outside of their native range into new habitats and have become urbanized. So this amazing photo, except for the one galah, which is up here in the upper part of the figure, these are little corellas in Australia, which have been transported and have expanded their range into novel areas, and they have completely adapted themselves to urban environments. And so this species, even though it's native to Australia, it's also a naturalized species because it has moved or been transported out into new areas, and now it's completely urbanized. It's very common. It's increasing population numbers very dramatically because of its adaptation to urban habitats. So lots of things are going on is what I'm trying to say. Birds are changing their own distributions and we are changing birds' distributions ourselves. So not surprisingly, you of course realize that the relationship of introduced species and humans is very complex. This shows a park in Barcelona, and you may notice that most of these parrots have numbered bird tags, not bands on them. These birds are part of a long-term population study of the birds in Barcelona. The amazing thing about the parrots in many parts of Spain is that the birds have adapted themselves to humans as much as humans have adapted ourselves to parrots. So now in parks in Barcelona, the birds get 40% of their daily diet from handouts from humans. So just imagine that, an introduced species that is so, I guess, accepted, so sort of tolerated, that now the birds are dependent upon humans for food in these areas. Obviously, this creates both interest as well as sometimes conflict with people. These are some of the parrots from San Francisco, part of the group of species called the wild parrots of Telegraph Hill. They are now a tourist attraction. They're very tame and people can easily draw them or track them down to be fed. Just illustrating again the complex interaction between people and wild birds that are highly intelligent and adaptive, and that can change their behavior according to our response to their presence. The interaction between humans and naturalized parrots is also a critical issue for aspects of conservation. These are yellow crested cockatoos. And I don't know if any of you heard in the news that just within the last week, there's only one remaining pair of wild yellow crested cockatoos, in the native distribution of the nominate subspecies in Southeast Asia. There are more yellow-crested cockatoos being sold in the open pet market in Singapore than there are in the wild. And so the importance of these introduced, and there are more yellow-crested cockatoos flying around the parks of Singapore as naturalized species than there are in the wild. So the interaction between the pet trade, populations of naturalized species and wild populations is an absolutely critical one if we're ever to work towards a conservation of some of these very highly endangered species. This slide I just put in because I love this slide. This is a free-ranging wild or semi-wild population of 2 species of macaws in southern England. And these birds aren't breeding in the wild. They fly home to an aviary and they roost and get fed in the aviary. And then the owner of this farm lets them fly all around the countryside in Cambria, England. And they have been there since, I think, the 1970s. So just illustrating the complex interaction between introduced and now semi-wild birds and humans. So as I said, approximately, well, it's actually about 130 to 140 of the species of introduced or transported parrots have been seen in the wild. 75 to 80 species are now breeding in one or more country. This just shows the global distribution of naturalized species, but the numbers shown down here on the bottom are really minimal estimates. Now, naturalized parrots, despite the fact that they are transported all around the globe, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can live everywhere. Although this graph may be a little bit hard to read on your screen, this graph is absolutely fascinating because this is continental Europe. And this line here, this dashed line, represents the northern and eastern boundary beyond which no parrot has successfully established a population. So you have rose-ringed and Alexandrine and monk parakeets in continental Europe, but none of those species can go above this or have gone above this line. And this line is set because of the severity of winter temperatures. So you occasionally see parrots above this line, but they simply can't breed. It's too cold. And so it's so cold that all of the birds around this upper region actually suffer severe consequences of frostbite. And so a 2 or 3 year old rose-ringed parakeet starts to lose its toes, unfortunately, because of frostbite. So they have much lower survival, very dramatic effects on the population biology. So we've transported these birds all around the globe. They've been amazingly successful, but of course, that doesn't mean they're going to be able to establish themselves everywhere. There are some obvious ecological limitations. In Europe, it's a fascinating situation. Most rose-ringed parakeets now nest in nest boxes nest boxes, or they nest in insulation on buildings. And this sets up a dramatic competition between a native species, the greater spotted woodpecker, illustrating both the adaptability of rose-ringed parakeets, but also some of the potential issues of conflict with native species, which is relatively rare, but it does occasionally happen. It shouldn't surprise you that some introduced parrots are an agricultural pest. Both the monk parakeet and the rose-ringed parakeet in some situations have been documented as eating a significant amount of grain, or in the case of monk parakeets, causing damage to electrical utility structures. Overall, the impact of naturalized species is either meaning there's no negative impact, or relatively minor. In a few isolated instances, there can be significant impact. One of those aspects of significant impact, besides the rose-ringed parakeet competing for nest boxes, is that there are very rare instances, but documented instances of rose-ringed parakeets attacking native bats. And this is an amazing photograph that the photographer was able to see the rose-ringed parakeet about to attack a species of native European bat called the greater noctule bat. And quite remarkably, this parakeet was actually able to kill this particular bat that was trying to roost in the same hole that the parakeet was nesting in. Monk parakeets in the United States are generally loved by the public everywhere they are found, but utility companies don't like monk parakeets. And the reason is because of their large, bulky nests. One of the favorite places to nest in many cities is electrical utility structures. And monk parakeets are remarkably adaptive at nesting on any structure, cell tower, but in this case, electrical utility structures. This is one transmission line in Miami-Dade County. And if you magnified this photo, if this is a nesting structure, in this case, there are 3 pairs of parakeets nesting in this one, 2 pairs of parakeets nesting in this one. And just in this one photo, there are 35 different nesting structures, and I think the total number was 75 or 80 pairs of parakeets were nesting within a quarter of a mile of this transmission line, just illustrating some of the issues that these parrots create. I'll try to, I don't want to extend my time too much. I'd rather hear what your questions are, but just very briefly and as quickly as I can. You may know that in the United States, we used to have 2 native species. The Carolina parakeet was endemic to the continental United States, contiguous United States. It's now globally extinct since 1918. And the thick-billed parrot, a Mexican species which extends into southern United States. The United States population of the thick-billed parrot is extinct, but the species still thrives or still is hanging on in the forest in Mexico. These days, without a question, the monk parakeet is the most common species in the United States. As I'll show you in a second, we now have 29 species of breeding parrots here in the United States. It's not all monk parakeets. On the left-hand side are the sightings of where monk parakeets are breeding in the United States. On the right-hand side are sightings in nesting areas of the other species of parrots. So the other species, the non-monk parakeet species, if you will, are even more widely distributed as a group than the monk parakeets are. But monk parakeets as a single species are the most common. Your perspective about parrots in the United States will vary depending upon the data source that you choose to refer to. So if you look at records, published records, there are relatively few species shown that are breeding, like eBird or Gavia records or iNaturalist records or Christmas bird count records. If you combine all of these records together, it's really a remarkable story, so that 56 species of parrots have been recorded in the wild in the contiguous United States. We now know that 25 species are breeding here, and they're breeding in 23 different states on the mainland. If you look at Hawaii, there are no unique species relative to the mainland, but Hawaii itself has 10 different species breeding. Puerto Rico is amazing. It has 35 species breeding and 4 unique species compared to the mainland. So within the United States as a whole, including Hawaii, of course, and Puerto Rico, there are 40 species of parrots breeding in some capacity, and of those, 29 species are naturalized. So an incredible diversity of parrots now in the United States. Even though in my life, all I see is the monk parakeets, although I love seeing monk parakeets, because most of these species don't get very far north except for the monk parakeet. The last few slides, and I'll end very quickly, I just want to point out that despite the interest of parrots, despite the opportunities for studying their biology, despite the occasional controversy that they create, these species of parrots are in some cases incredibly important. So this is the red-crowned Amazon on the left. There are now more red-crowned Amazons in the naturalized population in Southern California than there are in the native population in Mexico. So the survival of the red-crowned Amazons, we don't yet know this, and we hope it's not true, but it's possible that the survival of the species is actually going to depend on how we treat and what happens in the naturalized population, in this case in Southern California. These parrots also are fascinating in the biology sense because they teach us about species adapting to new habitats and about competition between species. This is the Budgerigar, and in Florida, there were as many as 22,000 documented Budgerigars nesting in nest boxes, I think in the early 1970s. That was the last time they were censused. By the early 1990s, they were all gone. Now, Budgerigars are so rare that they're not even listed on the state breeding bird list. How can an introduced species like the Budgerigar nesting in nest boxes go from 22,000 down to 0? We don't know, but there is a reasonable hypothesis that it had to do with competition with house sparrows that happened to use the exact same size opening in the nest boxes. And house sparrows became dramatically more common in Florida at about the same time that Budgerigars were declining. So very interesting opportunities to study aspects of ecology and ecological interactions. This is just an example, again, of the yellow crested cockatoo at a tree hollow in a park in Singapore. And with that, my favorite species, the monk parakeet, at one of its nests. So that's all I had as a way of introducing the topic and introducing the book. And I'm very happy to answer any questions or engage in a discussion. Either, let's see, so Alicia, should I stop sharing, or are we happy to look at this photo while we talk? I wasn't sure what to do.
You know, Steve, I would love to, as much as we love to look at your monk parakeets and our parrots and share that with you, I think I'd love to see faces of folks that have joined us.
Okay, yeah, so I agree. So let's, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm waiting to see if, as folks are putting questions or thoughts or conversations in the chat, I do have a question for you. You know, when you talk about naturalized and pests and introduced and that sort of thing, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that when I think of introduced species or species that have kind of naturalized, you know, I think of things like starlings, and you mentioned house sparrows and even, you know, house finches. But, you know, I don't have starlings are beautiful in the wintertime because they have that speckly feathers and that winter, you know, that winter sparkliness. But I think of them more negatively than I think of parrots when I see parrots that seem, you know, a little out of place. Is that kind of normal? I mean, you know, when I think about starlings and them displacing native species, you know, it's like, And, you know, when I put my bird feeders out, of course, we don't have them up here in Juneau, but, you know, when I was in the lower 48 and I put my feeders out, I specifically tried not to attract some of those invasive species. And, you know, but I have to admit, you know, if parrots came to my yard, I'd be a lot more thrilled about that. Is that a thing?
It is certainly a thing that people have complex emotions and thoughts about all of these species. It's also a thing that we think about species differently, even though, you know, they're all introduced. So yes, starlings and house sparrows are introduced, and some people might call them invasive, But where I am here in Chicago, in the Great Lakes, rainbow trout are introduced, so are brown trout, so are salmon, so are steelhead. And so from the freshwater biology perspective, these fabulously interesting game species that the economy of much of this area depends on could also be called introduced, or they are introduced. They could also be called invasive, but they are desirable invasive species because we, enjoy fishing for them, or ring-necked pheasants. People hunt for them, and nobody thinks negatively. Well, most people don't think negatively about these desirable introduced species, but we have negative introduced species or invasive introduced species. We have desirable introduced species. The white-tailed deer is so much more common now because it's become urbanized and it's adapting itself to urban habitats. It's invasive in new areas where it becomes common. So without a doubt, emotions and thoughts and the way that we think about species varies person to person and context to context, and whether you interact with those species. To some extent, that makes this whole discussion very interesting. It's really easy to get bogged down into the label of invasive or alien or introduced, because some of these terms have negative connotations, even though they shouldn't, in my opinion.
Thanks for that. We have a question from Allison. I'm going to lean into my computer a little bit so that I can read it. And in fact, Allison, I think you have a question, and would you like to come on, unmute and chat about your question?
Okay.
Kind of like combination. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Go forward.
So Allison, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear her either.
Yeah, Allison, we're only hearing bits and pieces. Let me read what she put into the chat, Steve.
Okay.
And maybe Allison, are you with us again? Okay, let me read what she's got in here. The Australian chapter discusses the ongoing risk of foreign parrots establishing, but earlier chapters mentioned that wild-caught parrots tend to be more successful invaders. Is the Australian risk less now that there is no legal importation of foreign parrots into Australia, though there may still be illegal imports? So most foreign parrots in Australia should be more likely to be bred in captivity?
That's a fascinating question. Thank you, Allison. So to others, what Allison is referring to is that there's been a lot of research into the question of what makes a successful invader, or what aspects of the biology of species makes it more successful in an introduced population. So for example, we know that species, really small species and really large species, are less likely to succeed than average sized species. Species with an adaptable or varied diet are more likely to be successful at establishing populations than species with a highly specialized diet. Those kinds of biological differences are really important in influencing the success of different species. What Allison was referring to is the fact that we have looked at, so some parrots that get into the wild were previously captively reared. They either escape or they were purposely released. Other parrots that get into the wild accidentally were caught in the wild, brought into a new area, and then escape captivity, but they were previously living in the wild as a wild bird. And people have found that the wild caught introduced birds are much more successful at establishing themselves than are the captively reared birds that get get released or are escaped. So Allison is wondering, now that Australia doesn't allow imports of wild birds and birds are only being bred in captivity, will that reduce the likelihood of future species being established? Allison, if I completely understand your question, and I think the answer is yes, but it's also the case that there are so many species in captivity in Australia that even though when these escape, there is a slightly less likelihood of them establishing, it's still the case that Australia is a great habitat for parrots. But interestingly, it is true that introduced parrots do have a much harder time in Australia, but it's not because they're captively reared. It's that Australia already has such an incredibly diverse native parrot fauna. So the more species of established native parrots that are in an area, it's much, much harder for an introduced parrot to get established. Whereas in the United States, we don't have any established parrots now. It's been very easy for introduced species to establish. In Australia, it's been very hard for introduced parrots.
Thank you for that, Steve, and thanks, Allison, for that question. And I noticed, Dave, I can't remember what you put in the chat earlier, but who's your friend? Who do you have with you tonight?
This is Calypso. Calypso's a maroon-bellied conure who, in the wild, her species would be in Argentina, and Paraguay, and Brazil, but she's captive reared, obviously. And she's 14 years old and is my very close friend. And so
Great.
when Stephen was showing all of those pictures of people in Barcelona and people in San Francisco interacting with the parrots, I was sitting here with Calypso snuggled up in my hand. So I've had direct firsthand experience with being a parrot owner and talking about that complex and shared relationship with parrots, and it is complex. She bit me on the face this evening, but now she wants to snuggle. So go figure.
They can make incredibly good pets, and every time anyone studies parrots, you just are left with the conclusion that they have remarkable cognitive abilities, and clearly they are so complex and they form lifelong, social bonds and relationships. And although I have to be honest and say I do not have a parrot as a pet, but I've always wanted one. But the people that I have interacted with a lot here in Chicago are the people in the rescue groups. And they just are really struggling because, for example, sulfur-crested cockatoos are one of the most common parrots that people buy in the pet trade. And they're buying this parrot that will outlive them if it lives a long life. A sulfur-crested cockatoo can live 70 to 80 years, and when they, unless they're prepared to care for it and multiple generations care for it, the parrot's going to end up, in a shelter somewhere. And it's a tragic situation with some of these incredibly intelligent and social and really long-lived species, and the effects of captivity that are having on them. But the smaller and medium-sized species that are cared for, I think they can have a great life. Personally, I like to think that they can.
Just simply, as a parrot owner, I would not recommend a pet parrot for the vast majority of people because they're very needy. They're smart. They're needy. They want attention. They crave attention. It's like a parrot's like a puppy crossed with a toddler. And if you're not willing or able to provide that level of constant attention and affection to the bird for years and years and years, you really shouldn't do it. I mean,
yeah, I agree.
Calypso's, she's a little parrot and she's got a potential lifespan of almost 30 years. So she could theoretically outlive me. And that's a huge commitment. And I think a lot of people who buy parrots as pets buy them because they're cute and they're funny, and they have absolutely no idea what they're getting themselves into. So no, I wouldn't recommend it, even though she's the best pet I've ever had. But we have a really unique relationship, and I don't think most people are willing to commit like that. And so they shouldn't. They should just not do it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Dave. I know that, you know, I just hear the romanticness of having, you know, exotic pets, and people, you know, love them. They're beautiful. And I'm trying to remember. So Irene Peppenberg did a lot of research related to the intelligence of parrots, and you know, and it was, I think.
Yeah, that was Alex, the African gray parrot, which
Yes.
is now just called the gray parrot. It's the African gray parrot has been split into two species, but yeah, Irene studied Alex, the gray parrot. Yeah. Alex was remarkably intelligent, but I'm not sure that he as an individual was more intelligent than any other gray parrot. But Irene was able to document that and do experiments that proved convincingly that I forget the number of words that Alex came to know or could repeat or speak, but Irene was convinced that Alex could create and construct sentences from collections of words that she had not taught him, and that Alex could actually communicate complex feelings or emotions to Irene. It was amazing.
She spent a lot of time with that bird. And I just want to note for you, Steve, that Michael Goldstein, I don't know if he has to head out early or not, but he says, this was great. Stephen, thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to make sure you heard that from,
thank
from
you.
Mike Goldstein, if he has to scoot out a little early. Yeah, I think Irene did a lot of work with Alex, and one of the things I know that she had said was that she was a little concerned with her work and how much publicity it got, that people would have a romantic notion about parrots, and she didn't want to necessarily feel like she was encouraging people to own parrots. And to Dave's point, if they, you know, long lives and they take a commitment, and they're you know, it's you have to, when you have pets, you need to be committed to them. Steve, I'm just waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, but you answered some of my questions in your presentation. But one of the things I do want to ask is basically, what was your biggest consideration for compiling all of this information and making it available? I know in your toward the end, at the end of the book, you know, you kind of talk about it, that this information could be shared with ornithologists and conservationists, and be a resource for even parrot owners or bird watchers. But can you elaborate a little bit on what you were thinking as you wanted to, you know, kind of bring all this information together?
Sure. And perhaps in 3 years, when I finish my next project, I can talk again. But so I've been studying monk parakeets since 1988, and then began to realize how common and abundant the other species have become, not just monk parakeets. And I began to realize that it would be great to have a project summarizing everything that we knew for the American parrots. And so my long-term goal is actually to write a book about naturalized and introduced parrots in the United States, and that's what I'm working on now. But I realized that in the early process of reading papers and summarizing the data, that this wasn't just an American problem, that it was a global problem. And I began to correspond with researchers around the world, and there are about 75 to 80, even up to 100 researchers actively studying introduced or naturalized parrots around the world. And I was just convinced that there were so many people interested in this, that my first writing project in this area would be to see if I could get a collection of the world's prominent researchers to make a statement about what was going on and what the important questions were, and sort of a survey of some of the interesting areas like Australia versus the United States. So it was really just realization myself that this is a global issue, that it impacts biology and ecology and conservation and human interactions with wildlife, that I wanted to sort of do this first, and then in the process learn as much as I can, so that when I tackle the issue of American parrots or parrots in the United States, that I would have the experience necessary to do that. But as I suggested, in the United States, it's a fascinating issue because we had 2 species that are now extinct, and yet now we have another 29 species that are found all across the entire United States. And so where these species are, how they are succeeding, are there any issues, how are people interacting, and what are the important resources that these species provide, is what I'm going to work on now on the next project, so to speak.
Yeah, fascinating. So we have a few minutes left. I did put into the chat your website, or the website at least that takes you to Ecology and at the chicago.edu. Yeah. So I believe that has an email and so forth. Allison has a question that I think is going to take more than a few minutes to answer. So I wonder if she might be interested in having a conversation with you offline with a little more. I think she's very keen on hearing more about your many years of research project in Australia. So I think that might be something that maybe you guys could have a longer conversation than we have time here for tonight.
That's fine. And I just would like to say that if there are any educators out there that like or would like to have a PowerPoint presentation for their classes, I'm happy to share with them my own PowerPoint presentations. I can't share photographs from somebody else like that I used in the book, but I have a lot of data, or I have papers, that very general papers as well as more technical papers, that if anyone is interested, they just have to write to me and initiate a conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm just fascinated by parrots myself. When I lived in Florida, among parakeets, they were something that, that was an everyday occurrence. And as I moved farther and farther north, become less so. I do remember I was driving through a neighborhood with my daughter, and I saw a budgie bird fly across the road, and I was like, what was that? As a bird watcher, of course, I had my binoculars, and and I'm looking, and couldn't quite see where it flew. But when we got back to the car, it was literally hanging on the tire of my car, just
wow,
perched there. And my daughter was just like 3 or 4 years old, and I'm like, okay, what do? I can't drive away with this bird hanging to my tire. And so as I looked closer, it had a band. It had bands on it that signaled to me it was a pet of some sort and registered somewhere. And so I carefully moved it from put it in a shoebox that I carry, because as a songbird rehabilitator, I always carried tools with me in case I needed to for injured birds, and never did find the owner of that bird. But there was a bird club, a Parakeet club, that took it off of my hands just because I didn't want the responsibility of gorgeous bird, cute little bird. But, as Dave said, it's like, their responsibility. And I was a single mom doing a lot of stuff. And but it's a fun thing to have happen, I guess.
Yeah, so that bird would have been clinging to your tire because, or I'm just guessing, but it's pretty consistent in that when birds escape captivity for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they really have to build up their muscles, their wing muscles, their breast muscles before they can really fly strongly. So I suspect it was hanging onto your tire because it was a weak flyer, right? And you were able to pick it up, right? It
Yep.
couldn't couldn't
Yeah,
fly
didn't fly
away.
away.
So it was both semi-tame and exhausted. So you're able to pick it up, and that's the classic sign of a bird that was recently escaped or recently released from captivity. In Florida, it probably would have survived. We see those birds every year in Chicago, and unfortunately, if you can't capture them, and they almost certainly won't survive the winters. But we see parakeets or parrots, almost every year of that type, recently escaped.
Well, Steve, this has been absolutely fascinating. And I really enjoyed perusing through your book and learning a lot more. And like I said, you answered so many of my questions that I had, as you were presenting. And so,
well, thank you very much. It's 8 o'clock. I'm happy to hang out if anyone wants to, if Allison wants to do a private chat, that's fine. Otherwise, thank you for the opportunity, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I think we're going to have to close down this Zoom.
Okay.
Now, Mikkel Moore, she just did pop in a quick question. I think we have time for just a quick question.
Sure.
How do the monk parakeets survive Chicago winters?
Yeah, I should have talked about that, because I have that's one of my favorite topics. If you think about what a bird needs to be successful, it needs food, and it needs shelter and protection from the elements and a place to nest, right? So that's why most birds are migratory, because they don't have food in the winter. So monk parakeets, of the 380 species of parrots, there's only one that builds its own nest, these large stick structures, and that's the monk parakeet. It's completely unique among the other 380 species. It's the only one that builds its nest. So it doesn't need a palm tree. It doesn't need a tree hollow. It doesn't need anything. It builds its own home. But even more importantly, it has one of the most variable diets ever described for parrots. So it eats normal parrot things like dandelion seed heads or crab apples or holly berries. But during January and February and March in Chicago, the only thing it eats is seed from backyard bird feeders. So it completely changes its diet. When there's no natural food available, it visits bird feeders every single day. And so we have published the hypothesis, that if people did not feed birds through backyard bird feeders, that the monk parakeet would never survive in these cold climates. And we still believe that. It's pretty hard to test experimentally, because there are a lot of bird feeders in Chicago. But we honestly believe that monk parakeets could not survive in really cold climates if it weren't for bird feeders. So they survive Chicago because they build their own nest. They don't require, large trees for nesting, and because we feed them during the coldest periods of the year. And the rest of the year, they're perfectly capable of finding plenty of food in parkland and open habitat.
Thank you for that, Steve.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Mikkel, for the question. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate your joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Remind Me Daisy, March 17. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah. The next one. Visit us
17,
online.
March 17. Yes.
Yes.
People are
Okay.
watching.
Visit us online, visit us via Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that other great stuff. And thank you again, Steve, for your fabulous book.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Daisy. And if we're signing off, then if Allison wanted to chat, she would contact me individually.
Yeah,
right?
she did say that she would do that, because I think
okay.
she is keen on a
sounds
bigger
great.
conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Great.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much, everybody.
Good night, everybody.